He killed without warning. No struggle, no witnesses, no evidence. When the police arrived, the street was silent. Too silent. No footprints, no fingerprints, no camera footage that made sense. Just flashing lights cutting through the darkness, and a figure already gone. For years, investigators chased leads that led nowhere. Every suspect collapsed. Every theory failed. It was as if the killer understood the system better than the people sworn to stop him. Then came the final 24 hours. A sudden call, a single mistake, a discovery that changed everything the police thought they knew. Because this wasn't just about a murder. It was about how someone could erase themselves and walk away while the whole country was watching. So ask yourself this: how could someone commit murder and disappear completely? In the quiet town of Springfield, safety was a shared belief. Children played in the streets until sunset. Shopkeepers closed their doors without fear. Police sirens were rare and usually distant. That belief ended on a single night. The victim was someone familiar, a face neighbors recognized, a routine life with no known enemies and no reason to expect danger. Yet sometime between nightfall and dawn, that life was taken. There was no forced entry, no sign of chaos. Whoever did this didn't rush and didn't panic. As investigators moved through the area, one truth became harder to ignore. The killer didn't come from outside the town. They blended in, went to work, greeted neighbors. Nobody suspected that someone living just steps away could be hiding a secret capable of taking a life. And that realization made every familiar face feel different. Because the danger hadn't arrived. It had already been there. It started with a scream at exactly 2:07 a.m. One sharp sound, cut short. At first, neighbors weren't sure what they heard. Some thought it was a nightmare. Others assumed it was an argument, quickly settled. But one person called the police anyway. By the time patrol cars arrived, the street had gone quiet again. No movement, no voices. Just flashing lights reflecting off closed windows. Officers followed the sound to a small house near the corner of the block. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked ordinary. Furniture untouched, lights still on, a phone charging on the kitchen counter. Then they found the body. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no weapon left behind. It didn't look rushed. It didn't look emotional. It looked planned. Detectives arrived within the hour and sealed off the area. They expected evidence. They always did. Instead, they found almost nothing. One partial footprint near the back entrance. A single glove dropped in the grass several meters away. No blood trail. No fingerprints that led anywhere useful. It was as if the killer had stepped in and then stepped out, without disturbing the scene. Neighbors were questioned before sunrise. No one had seen anyone enter or leave the house, no unfamiliar cars, no suspicious movement. Several people admitted something unsettling. They had been awake. They had been close. And yet they noticed nothing. Investigators searched for cameras next. Traffic cameras, shop cameras, private home systems. There were blind spots everywhere. The nearest working camera stopped recording that night due to a power issue. Another was pointed away from the street. One more had footage, but the timestamp skipped over the exact window investigators needed. Too many gaps, too many coincidences. Detectives reviewed the timeline again and again. The estimated time of death gave the killer a narrow window, less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes to arrive, 10 minutes to act. 10 minutes to disappear. And somehow, they used every second perfectly. By morning, news of the crime had spread. Police vehicles lined the street. Yellow tape blocked off familiar paths. Residents stood in small groups, whispering. Fear didn't arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, because this wasn't a random place, and this wasn't a random victim. The killer knew the house, knew the layout, knew when the victim would be alone. This wasn't chance. As the investigation continued, detectives searched the victim's life, phone records, messages, recent contacts. Nothing stood out. No threats, no arguments, no signs of trouble. Friends described the victim as cautious, routine-driven, predictable in the safest possible way, which made the crime harder to explain. If there was no conflict, no warning, no trail, then what exactly had led the killer to that door at 2 a.m.? Forensic teams returned to the scene twice. They measured distances, recreated movements, tracked possible escape routes. Every path led back to the same problem. Someone had planned this long before that night, and whoever it was, they had thought about what would happen after. Because once the police finished searching the house, once the street reopened, once the lights were turned off again, there was still no sign of the person responsible. No arrest, no clear suspect, no explanation, just a town realizing something terrible. If someone could commit murder so quietly, so quickly, and leave behind almost nothing, then the signs weren't obvious. They were hidden. So the question wasn't just how the killer escaped. It was this: if someone could vanish like that, would you have noticed the warning signs before it was too late? In the weeks after the first murder, police believed the worst was over. They were wrong. 36 days later, another call came in. Different street, same town. This time, there was no scream. Just a neighbor who noticed a front door standing open long after sunrise. Inside, investigators found a scene that felt disturbingly familiar. No forced entry, no weapon, no sign of panic. And once again, the person responsible was already gone. At first, detectives resisted the connection. Different victim, different location, no obvious link. But the similarities were impossible to ignore. The timing was precise. The entry was quiet. The exit left no trail. And just like before, there were blind spots in the cameras, too consistent to dismiss. Within days, a task force was formed. Local detectives were joined by state investigators, then federal consultants. They built timelines, mapped movements, compared details frame by frame. What emerged was not chaos. It was order. The killer struck during narrow windows of time. Late night, early morning, moments when attention dropped. Every location sat just outside heavy surveillance zones. Every victim lived alone. Every crime scene showed control. No hesitation. No excess. By the third incident, fear became public. Residents stopped walking alone after dark. Stores closed earlier. Street lights stayed on longer. Parents began checking doors twice, then 3 times, and still, nothing stopped it. The third victim was found 2 months later, this time in a neighboring town. That's when the pattern became impossible to deny. Investigators overlaid maps of the crime scenes. The locations formed a loose arc, each one connected by major roads, yet separated enough to avoid routine patrol overlap. The killer wasn't drifting. They were choosing. Experts were brought in to build a profile, not a name, not a face, a mind. They described someone methodical, someone patient, someone who planned weeks ahead. This wasn't rage. This wasn't impulse. This was selection. The killer studied routines, tracked schedules, waited for silence. They knew how police worked, how evidence was collected, where mistakes were usually made. One profiler said something that stayed with the task force. "This person doesn't take risks," he said. "They remove them." Families of the victims struggled to understand what had been taken from them. One mother described setting the dinner table out of habit, then realizing no one would ever sit there again. A brother replayed their last conversation over and over, searching for something he might have missed. A neighbor said the street felt smaller now, closer, watching, because the killer didn't feel distant. They felt near. As media coverage intensified, tips flooded in. Thousands of calls, hundreds of theories, ex-partners, co-workers, strangers seen walking at night. Each lead was followed. Each one collapsed. The killer left no personal signature, no message, no pattern of escalation, just silence between crimes. And that silence became part of the fear, because no one knew when it would end or where it would move next. Then something changed. At the fourth crime scene, investigators found something they hadn't seen before. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't dramatic, but it didn't belong. A small object, partially hidden, easily overlooked. At first, it seemed meaningless, but when analysts compared it to earlier scenes, a troubling possibility emerged. This hadn't been left by accident. It had been placed, not to help police, but to test them. The task force went quiet. Details were withheld from the public, even from some officers, because now there was a new concern. What if the killer was watching the investigation, following the news, tracking the progress, adjusting accordingly? Another profiler offered a warning. "When a killer feels unseen for too long," he said, "they sometimes check to see if they still are." The object led to a trail, but not a straight one. It pointed toward a location already cleared. A person already questioned, a lead already dismissed, a dead end. Or so it seemed. Because when investigators looked again, they realized something unsettling. The dead end had been chosen. The killer wasn't hiding randomly. They were shaping the search. And the deeper police went, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't about escaping justice. It was about control. Control over space, control over time, control over fear. Months passed. The crimes stopped. No new victims. No new scenes. Some believed the killer had moved on, left the area, or stopped altogether. Others feared something worse, that the pause was intentional, that the silence meant preparation, because every time the killer struck before, it had followed a period of calm. And now, another calm had arrived. Then, nearly a year after the first murder, a single detail resurfaced. A forgotten report, a note taken early in the investigation, a discrepancy no one had prioritized. It was small, but it didn't fit, and when detectives pulled the file and compared it against the full timeline, everything shifted. Because that detail didn't just raise questions, it rewrote assumptions. And suddenly, the mystery didn't feel distant anymore. It felt close, too close. Then a clue appeared, but instead of providing answers, it made the truth harder to reach than ever before. By the second year of the investigation, confidence inside the task force had worn thin. Leads that once felt promising collapsed without warning. Evidence collected early no longer lined up. Witnesses changed their stories, or stopped cooperating entirely. Some people genuinely misremembered, others wanted attention. A few were simply afraid. Detectives spent weeks chasing movements that turned out to be impossible. Cars reported at the scene were later proven to be miles away. Timelines overlapped in ways that made no sense. Every answer created two more questions. One of the biggest problems was time. The first crime scene hadn't been preserved with the expectation of more murders. Small details that might have mattered later were gone forever. Footprints washed away, digital records overwritten, memories faded. The killer had benefited from that delay. Then came the suspect. He lived within the original search radius. His routine overlapped with multiple crime windows, and he had once worked in a job that gave him access to restricted areas. For the first time, investigators felt close. They brought him in quietly. Hours of questioning followed. Every word examined, every pause noted. At first, the story didn't hold. There were gaps, contradictions, moments that felt rehearsed. Media outlets picked up the development almost immediately. Headlines spread fast. Police close in. Break-in serial murder case. Suspect identified. The town reacted with relief and fear. People searched old photos. Neighbors replayed conversations in their heads. Some convinced themselves they had always known something was wrong. But then the case against the suspect began to weaken. Phone records placed him elsewhere during one of the crimes. A work log, verified independently, accounted for another night. The strongest point against him relied on a witness who later admitted uncertainty. The suspect was released. No charges, no apology, no explanation to the public. And just like that, momentum vanished. Some detectives believed the suspect had been lucky. Others believed the killer had studied the investigation closely enough to frame someone else. Neither theory could be proven. Public trust began to crack. Online forums filled the gaps left by police silence. People created maps, timelines, suspect lists. Innocent names were dragged into discussions. Photos shared without consent. Accusations spread faster than facts. Families of the victims watched strangers debate their loved ones' deaths like puzzles. Grief turned into anger. Anger turned into pressure. The media intensified coverage. Every anniversary brought new speculation. Every leak sparked another wave of fear. Residents began reporting each other. A man walking late at night, a car parked too long, someone who avoided eye contact. Police lines rang constantly, and still, nothing solid emerged. Inside the task force, frustration grew. Different agencies disagreed on priorities. Some wanted to go public with more details. Others believed secrecy was the only advantage left. Files were reviewed again. Evidence boxes reopened. Detectives began questioning their earliest assumptions. What if the killer hadn't been local at first? What if the pattern wasn't geographical but personal? What if the victims were connected in a way no one had noticed? They rebuilt the case from the beginning, minute by minute, choice by choice. That's when they noticed something subtle. Each crime had occurred shortly after a change in routine. A new job, a shift in schedule, a recent move. The killer hadn't just known the victims. They had known when things changed. That raised a dangerous possibility. What if the information came from someone who didn't stand out? Someone with access, someone trusted, someone invisible? Detectives returned to employment records, service visits, delivery routes, anyone who could enter a home without suspicion. The list was long, too long. Months passed without another crime. Some believed the killer was gone. Others feared something worse, that the pause meant planning. Then something unexpected happened. A journalist received an anonymous message. Not a confession, not a threat, just a reference. A detail from the first crime scene that had never been released. Police were alerted immediately. The message couldn't be traced. The account vanished within minutes. But the damage was done. Only investigators and the killer could have known that detail, which meant one thing. The person responsible wasn't guessing. They were watching, following the case, tracking the coverage, waiting. The task force tightened security, restricted information even further, because now the question wasn't just who the killer was, it was how close they had come to being exposed already, and whether the next appearance would be another crime or something far more calculated. Just when everyone began to believe the case had reached a dead end, something appeared that no one had been expecting, and it threatened to change everything. The breakthrough didn't arrive loudly. There was no announcement, no celebration, no sudden certainty. It came from something small, almost forgotten. A phone. It had been logged into evidence months earlier, found discarded several streets away from the second crime scene. At the time, it seemed useless. No SIM card, no recent calls, no obvious owner. Investigators assumed it had nothing to do with the case. But when the task force rebuilt the timeline from the beginning, someone noticed a detail that had been missed. The phone had been powered off deliberately. Not damaged, not abandoned in panic. Turned off. That mattered. A technician was asked to examine it again, this time without assumptions. What they found changed everything. Deep within the device was a partial location history. Not enough to show ownership, but enough to show movement. The phone had been active near 2 crime scenes. Not during the murders. Before them. Days before. That meant planning. Investigators widened the search. They rechecked fingerprints that had been dismissed early on, prints too faint to match anyone in the system at the time. Technology had improved since then. When the data was reprocessed, one print returned a partial hit, not a name, but a category. Someone who had been fingerprinted for a non-violent reason years earlier. Someone who had never been considered dangerous. It wasn't proof, but it was direction. The crime board was rebuilt again. Photos, maps, strings crossing timelines, patterns became clearer. The killer wasn't just avoiding cameras, they were studying habits. They knew which streets lost lighting after midnight, which cameras went offline during maintenance, which patrols followed routine paths. This wasn't luck, it was preparation. Experts were consulted again. This time the profile shifted, not impulsive, not reckless. This was someone who needed control, someone who rehearsed outcomes, someone who adjusted after each event. They weren't escalating for attention, they were refining. One profiler said something unsettling. "This person isn't running," he explained. "They're managing." As investigators closed in, subtle changes were noticed. Online activity connected to case discussions slowed down. Anonymous tips stopped suddenly. It was as if someone had gone quiet. He was close, but he knew they were watching. Every move measured, every decision deliberate. Detectives began discreet surveillance on a small group of individuals who fit the refined criteria. Not arrests, not confrontations, observation. And then came the mistake. A traffic camera, long thought unreliable, captured a vehicle passing through a maintenance blind spot near the third crime scene. The footage was old, blurry, but when enhanced, a detail stood out. A sticker on the rear window. Uncommon, specific. Investigators searched vehicle records. Only a handful matched. One belonged to someone already on their list. When questioned casually, the explanation sounded reasonable. Too reasonable. Timelines matched on paper, but not in reality. Work schedules had been altered after the crimes. Digital records edited days later, not forged, adjusted. That was the difference. Someone had gone back. Trying to clean traces, they thought no one would check again. Psychologists weighed in. What drives someone to kill and then live a normal life afterward? The answer wasn't emotion. It was separation. The ability to divide actions from identity, to return home, to blend in, to believe control meant safety. Surveillance intensified. Investigators waited. And then, something unexpected happened. The suspect visited a location connected to one of the victims. Not a memorial, not a coincidence. A place never mentioned publicly. That detail had only existed in sealed files. The tension tightened. Arrest teams prepared quietly. But still, no move was made. Because one wrong step could end everything. They needed certainty. They needed one final piece. It arrived days later. Another overlooked print. Not from a crime scene. From the discarded phone. This time the match was stronger. Strong enough to place the device in the suspect's hands. The room went silent. Years of questions narrowed to a single point. But even now, investigators hesitated. Because someone this careful would expect the end, and desperate people make unpredictable choices. As the net closed, one thought stayed with the team. This wasn't just about catching someone. It was about understanding how close they had been. For so long. So ask yourself, with the same clues, the same delays, the same pressure, could you have pieced it together faster than the police? After years of uncertainty, the investigation reached its narrowest point. The task force had a name, a history, a pattern that finally made sense. Detectives believed they understood how he planned, how he waited, how he stayed ahead. What they didn't expect was where the trail would lead. The suspect wasn't found at home. He wasn't found at work. When officers arrived with a warrant, the house was empty, not disturbed, not abandoned in haste, clean, organized, almost staged. Personal items were missing: clothes, documents, a laptop. But other things were still there. Furniture untouched, food in the refrigerator, mail stacked neatly on the table. It didn't look like someone running. It looked like someone who had planned an exit. Phone records showed activity days earlier, nothing after. Bank accounts were quiet. No sudden withdrawals, no obvious trail. Airports were checked, border crossings flagged. Nothing. For a brief moment, panic set in. Had they waited too long? Investigators expanded the search. Old addresses, past employers, distant relatives, they followed every connection backward. That's when something unexpected surfaced. Years before the first crime, the suspect had traveled briefly under a different name. Not illegally, not suspicious at the time. Just quietly. The name was real, the documents valid. But the identity had gone cold afterward. This raised a disturbing possibility. What if the person they had been chasing wasn't the first version? What if this wasn't disappearance, but repetition? Authorities considered several theories. One suggested escape, that he had crossed borders using documents no one thought to question, that he had blended into another country the same way he blended into neighborhoods. Another theory suggested something closer, that he never left at all, that he had changed routines, altered appearance, returned to ordinary life under a different shape, hidden in plain sight. And then there was the third possibility, the one investigators discussed quietly, that the killer had planned a final act, not another crime, but an end. Search teams were sent to remote areas connected to his past, places he once visited, places that offered privacy. Nothing was found, no body, no confirmation, only absence. Media coverage exploded. Suspect vanishes. Years-long hunt ends in questions. Did police lose him? Public reaction split. Some believed the killer had outsmarted everyone. Others believed the case had never truly been close. Families of the victims were left suspended. No trial, no answers spoken aloud in court, just a name that might never be tested. Investigators reviewed the last confirmed sighting again and again. A security camera outside a train station. The footage was grainy, the angle imperfect, but the walk was familiar, the posture, the timing. He checked nothing behind him, didn't rush, just moved forward, as if confident that no one was following anymore. Then he disappeared into the crowd. Years later, detectives still debate that moment. Was it the end of the trail, or the beginning of something else? Some believe he made one final mistake, one that simply hasn't been discovered yet. Others believe the opposite, that the final mistake was assuming there would be one. Because throughout the case, the killer never acted without thinking several steps ahead. And that's what makes this ending so unsettling. There is no confirmed capture, no confirmed death, only theories and unanswered questions. Even today, officers involved in the case admit the same fear, that somewhere, someone who once understood how to kill quietly also understood how to disappear. And if that's true, then the most disturbing question remains unanswered. Was the hunt over? Or did he simply decide it was time to stop being seen? Because if he's still out there, then the story didn't end. It just went silent. When the investigation faded from headlines, the impact did not fade with it. For the families, there was no resolution to hold on to, no verdict, no final moment of justice. Just unanswered questions that followed them into everyday life, questions that return in quiet moments, questions with no one left to ask. In the communities touched by the case, routines changed permanently. People locked doors earlier, paid closer attention to unfamiliar faces, trusted less easily. The fear wasn't constant, but it lingered. Law enforcement carried the weight in a different way. Detectives involved in the case speak of restraint, learned through failure, of patience sharpened by missed chances, of how small details, once ignored, can become the difference between clarity and doubt. Psychologists point to something even more unsettling, that the person responsible did not stand out, did not draw attention, did not live on the margins. They blended in. Cases like this force an uncomfortable truth into focus, that the most dangerous threats are not always visible. That harm can exist behind ordinary routines, behind familiar faces, and that sometimes the absence of answers is the deepest scar left behind. The trail went cold. The killer vanished, or chose to disappear. What do you think happened? Did he escape? Did he hide in plain sight? Or was there a final mistake we'll never know about? Could you have solved the mystery before the police? Could you have seen the clues they missed? Which detail shocked you the most? The discarded phone, the overlooked fingerprint, or the movements only he could plan? Share your theory in the comments, vote in the poll, and join the conversation before the next clue appears.